All right, so we have a couple of questions for. These are questions that come from a couple different texts throughout the Bible. One's from Matthew 15, where Jesus has the encounter with the Syrophoenician woman. The whole section of Matthew, where Jesus goes from feeding 5,000 to some encounters with the Pharisees, and then the Syrophoenician woman, and then the feeding of the 4,000. The whole section has this theme of what constitutes what is clean and unclean. And the questioner is asking, why does Jesus seem to not be so friendly towards her? She comes looking for help, and he doesn't immediately respond to her in a positive way. Well, I think what's going on here is that Jesus is contrasting ultimately the difference between the attitude of those who should have followed after him and viewed themselves as clean versus the persistent attitude of someone who should have viewed themselves as unclean and unworthy. And he's letting that play out, as it were, in the encounter with this woman. And so I would say this: Jesus knows she's not going to give up. He, with his full divine knowledge, along with his insight into what she is already presenting herself as a very persistent individual, Jesus, knowing that, lets this drama play out. And so if you watch, for instance, the feeding of the 5,000, when he's done with feeding the 5,000, we have 12 baskets of leftovers afterwards. Then they travel, and they wind up then in this encounter where Jesus, while traveling, tells his disciples, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. We have this discussion about what's clean and unclean in terms of washing, ceremonially washing the cup, all those kinds of things. But in the middle of all those discussions and the feeding of the 4,000, in the middle of all that, he encounters this Gentile lady. And this Gentile lady, she believes in Jesus as the Messiah. She has faith in him, and she believes in his ability to heal her daughter. And her persistence is then laid in contrast with the persistent rejection by those who should have received Jesus as their Messiah. And so I think Jesus lets that drama play out. What's interesting is the feeding of the 5,000 occurs in a Jewish area. We then have the rejection by the Pharisees of Jesus, the debate over what's clean and unclean. And then we have the Syrophoenician woman encounter, where Jesus seems to, at the end of that encounter, not only heal her daughter, but embrace her act of faith. And then we have the feeding of the 4,000, which occurs in a Gentile area. The Syrophoenician woman becomes, as it were, the fulcrum, or the hinge point through which Jesus shifts his attention from a more Jewish-only parochial ministry to a worldwide ministry that involves both Jews and Gentiles. And the Syrophoenician woman becomes the example of that in the middle of that transition through Matthew's gospel. So I think the reason for Jesus' immediate response to her not being quite as, shall we say, warm or friendly, is he's letting the drama play out between himself and her to demonstrate his own shift now in the relationship between himself and the world as a whole, Jews and Gentiles, and also the persistence of her faith being contrasted with the persistence of unbelief by the Pharisees that he was encountering. So I think she functions as a parable, a real parable of the actual distinction between Jews and Gentiles, or Pharisees at least, and this Gentile woman. The second question for this week has to do with the text out of Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12, and it describes the star of the morning falling from heaven. And there was a time when people viewed this verse as being a picture of Satan falling from heaven. But during the time of the Reformation, and really from that time forward, most theologians now, when reading it in context, it is not a verse about Satan. Instead, the whole context of it is about the pride of humans, and how human pride, how we're lofty about ourselves, think too highly of ourselves, kings in particular during that time period, but really all humans. And the statement is they're like the star of the morning, both in their own mind and in their own perception of where they are. But God's promise is to cast them down and to break through that pride. And the question was asked, well, what about the reference to Jesus as the morning star in, say, the book of Revelation? And it is true that Jesus is referred to as the morning star. The difference is that the Isaiah text really is describing someone's own perception about themselves, saying, I'm like the star of the morning. And God says, oh, really? I'll cast you down from that lofty position. to God giving the title to his own son, saying, no, he really is the star of the morning. I think that's the difference there. I don't think the morning star in Isaiah 14 is a reference to the devil. I think it's a reference to just human pride, kings and all people. And I think the morning star in the New Testament, the difference is God is the one that gives Christ the title, Star of the Morning. Whereas in the Old Testament, Isaiah 14, it's humans attributing this title to themselves. So look at how good we are, and how God then breaks through that attitude by letting calamity come to those groups of people that had such an arrogant or self-exalting worldview. All right, those are the two questions we have for this week. And so thanks for the questions. We'll see you Sunday.